we are young, we often dream of the most bizarre things. We fashion little swords out of garden stakes and attack other boys and girls. Sometimes they get hurt, but that is the cost of war. War is a sad thing, but if done respectfully, it is also beautiful. Women don't understand this. Women are always ruining the fun. This book is dedicated to the imaginations of boys and the beauty therein. Screw off all you ladies and simps and enjoy the ride. This is the first book in the trilogy of Toadfarts. Garth Brown Mysteries, Book 6, X5WKD1R. Chapter 1, Garth's 11th Birthday. Garth Brown was a young boy with long legs but the torso of a small dwarf, making him only about 4 foot 11 inches tall. His fingers were longer than his stubby arms, but grown-ups had always pinched his cheeks and said he would grow into them one day. He had a fine middle-parted bowl cut and spectacular teeth. His 11th birthday had just struck. He bounced to and fro and jiggled so fiercely that even a goblin would stroke. This was no normal day for Garth. He had been living with a new family ever since his parents died in Florence. He was living with the Huka family. His best friend Sardine was a small girl around the same age of Garth. She had 7 older brothers that were very bad, but Garth lived with them. The adults that took care of Garth were so violent that on Valentine's Day they took Garth to the backyard and shot him. However, the bullets were of no power to Garth and he was only tickled by it. This shocked the family and made them ever more angry. One evening in particular, Garth's brother in prestitude, Splicing, said, "Garth, you are as estress as your old mother and I'm going to tell Mum and she will poison you." Just then, a bang shook the world. It was Professor Bumbleiscorf of the School of Detective Wizardry. He stood boldly in the doorway and took one long stride into the entrance. Garth could see that Professor Bumbleiscorf was no ordinary wizard. He had a long pointed beard, the upper lip as smooth as a baby's bottom, and was only 3 feet tall. He had 2 feet but only 1 leg between them. He was very obese. "Hello, Garth. You may come to my school," Professor Bumbleiscorf whispered sleeplessly. Garth was only 11, so he started to cry. He was so scared but yet so happy. "My life sucks here. May I grab you?" asked Garth. Garth grabbed the professor and tugged on his robes. "Oh please, may I?" Garth cried as he flipped his elbows over his arms gracefully and picked his lips slightly awkwardly. Professor Bumbleiscorf pulled out a large whistle and blew it in Garth's face. It was so loud and Garth was so small. Garth fell backwards on his bum. "Hey you. You okay?" asked Professor Bumbleiscorf. Garth got back up and saw that the professor was walking away. Garth followed and was joyous. "Sardine. You come too," shouted the professor from a distance. Sardine and Garth followed Bumbleiscorf down the street. As they walked, the professor shouted at children playing on their lawns. "You come too," he would say, and the children followed. Before too long, Garth looked back and saw there was now a train of 15 children following Professor Bumbleiscorf. They walked for hours and found themselves on the outskirts of the city. What stood in front of them were the dark forests of the west. "We have one more stop. Follow me," said the professor, pulling out a large torch. "Garth, come light my torch." Garth pulled out a match and struck it against his knee. The match took flame and Garth pressed it to the torch. The children followed Bumbleiscorf into the dark woods. He took 6 left turns and 4 right turns. As they continued on, the trees got so thick that Garth could feel sticks and shrubs poking him from all angles. Before too long, they reached a large dead tree with 4 rose bushes surrounding it. "Wait here for me, children. I shall be back soon with a surprise for you," Professor Bumbleiscorf said with a large twinkle in his eyes. wringing his hands in that devilish way he had. He was very good with children. Garth watched in amazement as Professor Bumbleiscorf disappeared into the bushes and left them alone in the dark woods. Garth turned around to see Sardine, who was winking at him, and all the other children who were sucking on the leaves. "Here you are. Look!" cried the high-pitched and oily voice of the professor. Garth turned to face the speaker and almost winced in terror, for he saw a little boy. Little only in age, for he was a very large boy. He had wild and piercing eyes and an astonishing cranial lobe. It was very strange. His hair seemed to be as red as a sparrow's breast, and it was all knotted and so organic that it almost seemed to be a living, breathing thing. At the sight of this wild boy, all the children screamed and began to giggle. Things like "Are you a goblin?" and "Ho ho, you must be a toad" were said by all the children gathered. Garth, having been all too familiar with the sins of other men, knew that this boy was being treated badly, and even thought to himself that this boy looked rather nice. "Hey, what is your name?" Garth said tenderly. "I know not, but I am he," replied the large boy. "Well, I've decided to call him Frizzy," cried Professor Bumbleiscorf with a hearty laugh and a smile. "All right, children, let us continue to the school. All of you shall require a walking partner. Garth, you seem to like this little boy. Hold his hand and let us go." Garth was so amazed but very curious. How could a boy of my age not have a name? He thought to himself. Garth's thoughts were interrupted by a darker thought. What if I am being sent away to prison? Just then a sudden boom shook the ground beneath them. There stood in front of Garth a mighty buzz. It had tires the size of whales, and Garth couldn't help but notice there were no windows but rather large tubes where windows should be on a normal buzz. "Get into your tubes!" shouted the professor. All the children froze still. Garth was tired of sitting back and watching others get the praise he deserved. Like a pig struck with fear, Garth bolted toward the largest tube. His legs failed him and he fell hard. His legs tumbled over his shoulders and his bum went straight into the tube. "Frizzy, you go into his tube," said Bumbleiscorf. Frizzy awkwardly approached the tube and sniffed Garth's bum. He growled and bit Garth's bum. "Oh-wee. Ooh!" howled Garth in pain. Bumbleiscorf pushed Frizzy into Garth's tube and closed it. Swoosh! Slump! Swoosh! The bus sounded and they were off. Before too long, the bus stopped and they were all ejected from their tubes. Garth stood up, dusted his pants off and looked up. He found himself on a sandy beach. He heard waves crashing on the shore and looked around. He was surrounded by sandy beaches and a sea as blue as the sky itself. He looked above his head and saw seagulls the size of elephants flying above him. He then turned towards a large pasture full of cows. Wait. No. Not cows. Not cows at all, for these were what he later discovered were called bootwomps. Bootwomps were a thing of ancient history, and their milk was very yellow and, as Garth later learned, held many mysteries. He then swooped towards Frizzy and noticed that he was on the ground crying while some pickle pixies were teasing him and poking his ears. "Oh yay, get away!" Garth cried as he chased off the pickle pixies. As Garth helped Frizzy up to his feet and swatted the dust of his large and smelly bottom, he looked up and saw a great castle. It peered over a large cliff overhanging the water. That is Toadfarts Institute of Detective Wizardry. I am Professor Bumbleiscorf and I am the head wizard chief. Chapter 2, Stephen, Bumbleiscorf, and Bird. Garth was escorted to the sleeping quarters. They were in a castle so large that any ancient prince would have been jealous. The corridors were long and twisty and the floors were cold on his toes. He screamed to see if it would echo back. "Ooey ooh ah ah," he screeched at the top of his lungs. Before he could listen to see if it echoed back, a tall arm reached from behind a door and grabbed him. A rope fastened over his ankles and a scarf was pressed against his mouth. It was a ghost, a poltergeist named Stephen the Poltergeist. "Hey you! I have a game for you to play with me," said the ghost. "Are you a ghost?" asked Garth. Yes I am," replied the ghost. "What's the game?" asked Garth. The game is called By Curious. I have to shout out two thoughts. If you are curious about both of them, you shout By Curious. But if you're only curious about one of my thoughts, I have to guess which one you're curious about. Alright, but what if I lose? Asked Garth. Now tut. Do not get ahead of oneself. Now play, insisted the poltergeist. Okay, I am sorry, replied Garth. Stephen, the ghost paused, twirled in the air and smiled sheepishly. Firstly he said, there are men in the graveyard. And secondly some lovers are best forgotten. Garth could not handle this and grabbed his belt. I have to go, he shouted as he put his pants around his jeans and ran away down the corridor. This was not what Garth had in mind. Oh yay, Garth. Cease and desist, cried a wispy old voice. It was Professor Bumblescorf. Professor. Garth wheezed. There is a disturbance down the corridor. He said his name is Stephen the Poltergeist. Garth could barely touch his knees, he was so flustered. Ah yes. Stephen likes to scare little bi-curious boys, but he means no harm. Bumblescorf said solemnly. I am not bi-curious. Garth replied with doubt in his voice. Never mind. Bumblescorf replied. I have something I want to show you. Follow me. The professor led Garth up to his office and hummed an ungodly tune all the way up. Once they arrived at the professor's door, he turned to Garth and said, now, Garth. I know you are only a young boy, but I need you to promise you will not scream. He then opened the door and they walked in. Garth sucked his own thumb curiously. Professor. What is that? Cried Garth. Professor Bumblescorf merely smiled and said, Garth, that is my Dicterius plumber bird. Your Dictawa? Garth asked curiously. My Dicterius plumber bird. He is a well-trained creature for delivering notes and removing unwanted guests. He is also very adept at tracking wicked criminals. Now go to dinner to meet the sorting gypsy. Chapter 3, The Sorting Gypsy. Garth made his way to the main hall to meet with the sorting gypsy. He was a little concerned that he might be placed on a team he didn't like, so he crossed his fingers and toes and went in hoping for the best. All the other children were sneezing and soon Garth began to sneeze himself as he approached. Once he and his 14 new fellow children joined the raging procession towards the front of the hall, it became very clear as to why. The sorting gypsy was sitting on a small stool and spraying sneezing powder into the air. Garth looked to his left to see little Frizzy wrestling with his nose to keep from blubbering. Hey Frizzy. Are you alright? Oh, I'm a little scared. Why do you suppose that gypsy is doing that? Frizzy replied. Garth did not have time to respond before the little gypsy started bellowing. Come here little children. Do not mind the sneezing powder. Nothing like a good sneeze to clear out all the brain wasps out in order to clear your thoughts. The gypsy squealed with a gleam in its eye. The gypsy was a very short person with large ears and golden jewelry all over its body. Garth could not tell its gender because of all the makeup and his eyes were watery from sneezing. Now, I am a sorting gypsy. I live my life in a little cell upstairs and come down every year to play the sorting game. Now, let's see. Let us begin with you. The gypsy pointed at a small boy who Garth knew from 2 blocks down the street. His name was Dusky Wharf. What is your name? I'm Dusky, sir. The little boy said, who had only now begun to wonder why he had followed a strange man to this castle. Well, Dusky. I sense an unusual aura with you. Now, let us play. Only listen to the words that I say and say the first thing that comes into your head. All right. Dusky replied. Entwist and his father, fire drowned by water, who do you belong to? I belong to the sneakers, Mr. Gypsy, replied Dusky as though in a spell. Then to the sneakers you shall go, cried the gypsy as he picked Dusky up and threw him over to the sneakers at their table. Now, another child. The process went on like this, with the gypsy sorting all the children into the 4 different units. The sneaks, the snoops, the dicks, and the peepers. Garth had always thought he could outsneak any Cuckooby, and Cuckoobys are known to be among the most traitorous usurpers known to man, so he dearly hoped that he would be put with the Sneaks. He really did not want to be with the Dicks because they seemed like the bad guys. Finally, everyone was sorted into their units until only Garth and Frizzy remained. The two boys were so nervous that they started kissing. "Now, boys. Approach," began the gypsy. The two boys walked cautiously towards the gypsy, trying desperately to not lose contact with each other. "I sense a strong bond between you." Garth and Frizzy, still kissing, looked at the gypsy curiously. "Frizzy and Garth, you are sneaky boys, aren't you?" "I am. My family trained me to be sneaky," Frizzy said with a twinkle in his eye. "And you, Garth?" "I am sneakier than a rodent in a pirate ship," Garth replied confidently. "You two shall join the Sneaks," the gypsy said as he morphed into a donkey and trotted off. "Did you hear that?" yelled Frizzy excitedly. "Yes. We are going to be Sneaks," replied Garth. Suddenly, an oily and powerful voice began to ring throughout the hall. Now, children. Please sit down," Professor Bumbleiscoff began. "Many years ago, almost 100 million years ago, there was a very hairy and prehistoric toad named Pokey Tokey Cum. Now, Pokey Tokey Cum was a very tall toad, much taller than his toad friends, and they would always tease him. One fine summer's night, when Pokey Tokey Cum was sitting by the pond and being teased by his toad friends, he heard a tremendous thunderbolt. Hours later, he awoke to realize this thunderbolt had struck him right in the backside, and he was stuck in the toad hospital for what seemed like ages. The day he was finally released, he went out to the street to find the whole village had made of him a laughing stock. Pokey Tokey Cum became so displeased that he let out a tremendous fart and turned all his friends into stone. He soon realized that the thunderbolt had given his bum tremendous power. Once all of his friends had turned into stone, he began to build a great castle and placed their statues around to ward off his enemies. This is the castle we are all so pleased to be eating in this evening. I tell you this story, both as a history lesson of our school, and also to remind you that no matter how pathetic you are now, one day you could have great powers. Garth knew at that moment that he wanted to be a wizard detective for life. "Hoy, Garth. Did you hear that?" said Frizzy. "Yes, I did. Now if you don't mind, Frizzy, I'd like you to go away," Garth replied. Frizzy's ears drooped and his bum pooped, and he went to his room and cried until morning. Garth, however, was on a hot streak. After the sorting of first years, Garth had gone into the lowest dungeon and found a family of house dwarves and had a dance-off with them and won every round. Once he was finished with the dwarves, Garth decided to go to bed. He slithered up to his unit's dormitory and found Frizzy staring at the moon and hugging a small beetle. Chapter 4, Toadfarts, Day 1. Garth awoke to the sound of something horrendous. It was the morning alarm that went off every morning at 3 a.m. The sound was something crossed between a mourning crow being tortured and a bulldozer backing over a pile of fire alarms. Garth stuck his fingers in his ears, closed his eyes and jumped from bed. He started running as fast as he could and ran into an older boy. "Check yourself," shouted the larger boy. "Oh, sorry. The sound scared me," replied Garth. "Oh hee, you silly little first year," replied the boy, sticking out his hand to shake Garth's. "My name is Julius Scoot and I am a third-class sneaker in training." "Nice to meet you, Julius. Today is my first day of classes and I do not know where to go," replied Garth as he shook the boy's hand. Garth noticed that Julius had slimy hands and chubby legs. Julius was no taller than Garth, however his legs were 1/3 the length of Garth's and his upper body was large and fat. His eyes were droopy and he flexed his chest and sniffed his nose with each breath he took. "Let me see your calendar. I will show you where to go," replied Julius. "Oh, thank you. Let me go get my friend Frizzy." Garth handed Julius his calendar and raced to grab Frizzy. Julius waited for Garth and once he returned the three were on their way through the corridors. Who looks like your first class is Sneakology with Professor Drubble. Garth and Frizzy approached a small door. It was far too low for Garth and Frizzy to enter, and they stood there, analyzing for 5 or 10 minutes. "You there, boys," a small voice said in a whisper. "You must crouch to enter this door. It is your first lesson in Sneakology." "Oh, of course," said Garth as he squatted down into what he thought was an excellent crouching posture. "No, no, no," the wispy voice said, as though someone had just murdered his entire family and taken his dog. "Try again. Bum out, left elbow tucked in and right elbow over your face." Garth tried again. He didn't quite get it right at first, but he was an excellent sneaker and managed to get it right much sooner than most of the class. As Garth entered the room, he gasped so loudly that a very large amount of saliva sprang from his mouth and landed with a splat on the floor. The room was made up of many other small rooms with tunnels and hallways going every which way. At the very front of the room there was a massive podium that stood 50 feet in the air. A very tall man with a trench coat, no eyes and a marvelous grin perched on top of the podium. Garth figured this must be Professor Drubble. "Welcome all first years," said the man. "I am Professor Drubble. Sherlock 4th class and precursor to Lincoln." The professor stopped speaking and looked directly towards Garth. He said as he pointed towards Garth, "I have a feeling you will do great things in this class." Garth started sweating so ravagely that he spanked Frizzy across the stomach and ducked behind Sardine. "Don't be scared. What is your name?" asked the professor. Before Garth could respond, Professor Drubble jumped off of his podium. The students gasped but were all amazed to see Drubble stretch out his trench coat like a ginormous eagle and soared towards the ground, landing directly in front of Garth. "Garth, sir," said Garth, nervously biting down on his gums. Garth Brown, perhaps?" asked Professor Drubble. Yes. You know me?" replied Garth in the most formal way he knew how. "But of course I do. Every wizard detective knows you, Garth." Garth spleened and spluttered and then returned to normal. Wow. How do you know me?" Garth said in a stutter. "I think perhaps it's time for you to speak with Professor Bumbliscorf. Please leave my classroom and make your way upstairs. And for crying out loud, don't spleen and splutter like that in front of him." Garth spleened and spluttered again and made his way out of the classroom and up to Professor Bumbliscorf's chambers. As Garth approached Bumbliscorf's door, he realized he had no idea why he had to speak to Professor Bumbliscorf all of a sudden. All Garth knew about himself was that his parents were dead and that his name was Garth. He knocked on the door, but there was no response. He became so curious that he leaned back and tucked his body under the door and slithered through. Once he had squeezed his last limb through the crack under the door, he stood and turned to gaze upon the room. Professor Bumbliscorf could not be seen, but his bird was eyeing Garth like a hungry goat that hadn't eaten in several days. "Hey you, bird. Where is thy master?" Garth questioned. "Tweet tweet tweet," the bird sung sweetly. "Now, bird, don't give me that." Garth was now so furious that his large forehead was pulsating. "That bird is very powerful, but I'm afraid English isn't his first language," said a wispy voice. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know," Garth said as he turned to see Bumbliscorf appear from behind the curtains. "Check yourself and move on," replied the old wizard detective. "What can I do for you, Garth?" Garth looked at the floor. He didn't quite know. "I don't quite know, sir. Am I special?" Garth asked awkwardly. "Oh, Garth. You are the most special boy I have ever met." "But, why?" Garth said with his eyes. Bumbliscorf laughed and pulled down a chalkboard from the ceiling. He began to draw a very tall stick figure boy and two smaller stick figure people holding his hand. "This is a family," Professor Bumbliscorf began. "A family much like any other. Except for one thing. These two people were murdered by an evil war wizard detective named Lord Fartamort," Bumbliscorf said as he erased the two small stick figure parents and drew them again lying down dead. "But their boy survived. It is not known why, but we have our suspicions as to why this boy was left alive, so we brought him here to see for ourselves. Do you mean he is here? Garth asked. Of course he is, Garth. That boy is you. Garth was utterly amazed by this. He didn't know what to think. Had he killed his own parents? Or did we? Or otherwise? My parents were wizard detectives, Garth said in astonishment. They were our top students of their year. Bumblescorf replied with a disgusting twinkle in his eye. There's a twinkle in your eye. Garth exclaimed. So there is. Bumblescorf said as he drew out a large pair of scissors and snipped it off. Nasty rodents those twinkles are. Aren't they, Garth? Knock it off. Garth cried. Now, back to business. How did I survive? That part is unclear. We do not know how you survived, but in his reign of terror, you were the only one. And since that time, he has been all but a forgotten girl. Now you best be off to bed. Garth hesitantly returned to bed, not knowing what would come next. Chapter 5, A Very Fetish Christmas. Situation Report, W.D. Garth Brown, October 11th, 3:02 a.m. I awoke from a funny dream where a weasel made off with all of my toiletries and I, Garth, had nothing to clip my toenails with. I was relieved to awake sweaty in my bunk the following morning for classes. Garth Brown Report Number 2, November 15th, 7:34 p.m. As the year goes on, I continue to excel at sneaking classes. No one can out-sneak me and I am always able to achieve the impossible. My other classes are at times a bit of a struggle. Potions today was a total disaster for me. At one point I felt I was nearing a breakthrough with a concoction to make all stresses vanish. I used wine, marshmallows, a pig's foot and some other ingredients. It didn't quite do it for me however, and I only ever managed to send myself to the hospital wing with a bad case of the itchy bum. Garth Brown Report Number 3, November 20th, 1:17 a.m. There was this one boy who seemed to fancy me, so I poisoned him, but the poison wasn't very powerful, so he didn't pass away peacefully. Garth Brown Report Number 4, November 21st, 2 p.m. Gadgets class is my second best class. I seem to have a knack for using every gadget in the book with near perfect accuracy. Garth Brown Report Number 5, December 13th, 12:01 p.m. All the other boys and girls are preparing for the Christmas holiday, and despite wearing my favorite reindeer costume, I can't get into the spirit. I do not look forward to returning to my wicked family. Frizzy is approaching. 12:07 p.m. Not to worry, he was inviting me to his home for the holiday to meet his family. I shall go. Garth Brown Report Number 6, December 24th, 11 a.m. Christmas break had begun and Frizzy and I made our way to his forest dwelling to meet his family. I had my trusty reindeer antlers on and was carrying a bundle of presents under each arm. I had bought a brand new radio for each member of the family. As we approached Frizzy's home, he turned to me and said, "Now, Garth, please be on your best behavior. My family is suspicious of strangers. I don't want them to be frightened. Oh, and Mother is very strict. Please do not put your hands on the table or she might bite your fingers." I agreed to his terms and entered through the front door. "Merry Christmas!" I cried. There was no one about. Just a group of hedgehogs nibbling at some dead worms. I turned to Frizzy to ask him where they were, but before I could speak, Frizzy rushed over to the largest and fattest hedgehog and said, "Merry Christmas, Daddy." The hedgehog squealed. "This is your family?" I asked politely. "Yes. This is my dad, this is my mum, and these are my siblings, Curly, Fungus, and Zuzu." I quickly shoved the pet hedgehog I had bought for Frizzy into a hole in the ground for fear that he might claim it as his wife. Frizzy squealed as he ran around hugging all of the hedgehogs. I hesitated but put on a nice smile and tried to avoid acting rude. "Nice to meet you. Here are your presents," I said as I put down the boxed radios. The hedgehogs sniffed them but went back to eating their worms. "Don't worry, Garth. "They'll come round," said Frizzy. This was small comfort for me. I could hardly begin to imagine my next 2 weeks living amongst these hedgehogs. I saw the look on Frizzy's face, and I knew he was happy. That was good enough for me. Garth and Frizzy spent the rest of the day sitting with the hedgehogs and updating them on how the school year was going. Despite the fact that he and Frizzy did sound remarkably like hedgehogs themselves when imitating their squeaks and squeals, Garth couldn't help but wonder if perhaps these hedgehogs had no idea what they were on about. Frizzy was so happy, however, that Garth had no desire to burst his bubble. He was beginning to grow quite fond of the strange little fellow. Days went by on the holiday and Garth was beginning to enjoy the daily routines. He had to help Frizzy with his chores, but Garth did not mind this. One frosty morning, Frizzy and Garth awoke extra early. This was so they could finish Frizzy's chores in time for the great snow stuff. Frizzy explained to Garth that this was something his family would do every Christmas. It involved Frizzy lying face down in the snow while all his family would gather as much snow as possible and stuff it in every possible nook and cranny of his body. Frizzy insisted that Garth could take Frizzy's spot this year since he was the guest. This made Garth very clammy and twitchy, however he did not want to be rude and simply smiled and slapped Frizzy on the shoulder whenever Frizzy would remind Garth of the festive activity. "Over here," croaked Frizzy as he started digging into the earth. "Oh-ee-ee. What you doing over there?" asked Garth curiously. "I'm digging for dead bodies," squirmed Frizzy as he stopped digging and looked Garth straight in the eye. "I'm digging for dead bodies," he repeated himself. Garth started to cry and shake in his boots. Garth threw his hands in front of his own eyes, shielding himself from Frizzy's devilish glare. Garth peeked occasionally to see if Frizzy was still looking. Frizzy was. "Why would you do that?" Garth finally squeaked out. "Well, to find maggots, of course," roared Frizzy. "Wait. Who is maggots?" asked Garth. "Not who, what?" replied Frizzy. "Maggot what?" asked Garth. "Quite right." Both boys paused. Garth's brain hurt so bad he took a brief minute to rearrange his intra-orbital organisms. "I'll just help you dig," replied Garth as he grabbed a little bumblebee that had dropped dead. Using the bumblebee's stinger as a shovel, Garth went to work. Just then both the boys were scared boopless. A tremendous crash was heard directly north of their corridance. "What in junk was that?" asked Frizzy. Before Garth could reply, loud footsteps were heard hurtling towards them. With a thud, a man came falling through the brush, crashing right before Garth. "Identify yourself. We are wizard detectives in training," yelled Garth. The big man got up and put his hands over each of the boys' mouth. "Shh. No time for introductions. I am the lumberjack. You are in grave danger." The lumberjack took his hands away from the boys and stood up. He towered over the boys, his head reaching to the top of the trees. His hands were as big as horses and his eyes dangled down to his nose. He carried a bare foot and had no clothes on. "Why are we in danger?" asked Garth as he eyed the lumberjack up and down. "It killed my whole family and Yuana." Before the lumberjack could finish his sentence, he bent over and died. "Oh goodness. That is sad," said Garth and Frizzy in unison. They noticed that they harmonized with each other and decided to try again, but to sing it instead. "Oh goodness. That is sad," Frizzy and Garth sang out loud. "Quick. We must go warn the family," yelled Frizzy. Garth started to follow Frizzy through the woods on their way back to the home. Running over trees and trudging through snow, they finally arrived. "Danger!" yelled Frizzy as he knocked down the door. The hedgehogs scurried around the room in a frenzy. Some pooped in the living room and others pooped themselves. Frizzy ran over to his daddy hedgehog and asked, "What should we do?" Before the hedgehog could reply, a loud ribbit was heard. Garth whirled around and was astonished to see standing in the doorway a toad. Not any more normal toad, but a toad with satanic eyes, fangs larger than a lion's and a tongue sharper than death. Garth knew that this was most likely his greatest enemy. Before Garth could muster up measly amount of courage he had, Frizzy's mom and dad charged heroically at the toad. The dad hedgehog crashed into the side of the toad while the mom jumped on top of the toad and started digging her claws deep into its side. "Get him, mommy!" shouted Frizzy. Before Garth could blink, the toad used its tail to whack mommy hedgehog. She went flying into the kitchen table. The toad turned around and bit daddy hedgehog in the foot. He howled in pain. Just then 4 more toads burst through the door. They carried grenades in their mouths. Using their tongues like slingshots, the toads slung the grenades towards Frizzy and Garth. "Duck!" yelled Frizzy. The grenades hurled past Garth and Frizzy and landed with a thud against the back wall of the house. Boom! The explosion blew up the entire house and sent the hedgehogs, Garth, Frizzy and the toads miles into the air. Garth lost consciousness for a few seconds, but when he came to, he noticed he was still soaring into the air. He looked around him and saw Frizzy's family in hand-to-hand combat with the toads as they too went soaring upwards. "Oh no!" yelled Frizzy. "Now we are starting to fall. We will splat on the ground and die." Frizzy was right, they were now falling towards the ground at speeds unfamiliar to mankind. Garth started to cry. He did not want to die like this. He had dreamed of being a wizard detective solving millions of cases. He was too young to die. He hadn't fallen in love yet. He hadn't ridden his first bike or tied his first shoelaces. He hadn't carried a baby in his arms or tortured an orphan. Garth closed his eyes and prepared himself for the worst. 3, 2, 1. Garth expected to crash into the earth, however he felt his body no longer falling at all. He opened his eyes. There he was, on the back of a glorious white eagle, flying high amongst the clouds. He looked backwards and forwards and noticed Frizzy and his hedgehog family were also on the backs of eagles. "We are saved!" yelled Garth. "The toads are dead and we are saved." "Not yet. Look!" pointed Frizzy. Garth looked up and through a thick mist emerged 4 devilish toads, flying on the backs of crows. At this instant, Garth became heroic. "Regroup!" Garth yelled, V formation. "Mommy hedgehog on my left. Daddy hedgehog on my right. Curly, Fungus, and Zuzu, you go behind mommy hedgehog. Frizzy. Oh my dear friend Frizzy, you will sit this one out." The eagles, with the brave hedgehogs riding on their backs, followed Garth's instructions and waited patiently for Garth's next orders. "Charge!" yelled Garth. He pulled out his bumblebee stinger and used it like a sword. Swooshing and slashing he cut down the enemy toads. Mommy and Daddy Hedgehog were also brilliant and took out another. Frizzy's siblings went for the leader toad, but they were too unmatched. The evil toad used its large fangs and pierced the hearts of Curly, Fungus, and Zuzu. One by one they fell from their eagles, dead. "No!" yelled Frizzy. This made Garth so angry. He yanked on the neck of his eagle and dug his heels into its side. The eagle flew towards the leader toad and his crow. Garth swung at the toad, but it ducked his blow and countered. The toad flung its tongue at Garth and struck him in the mouth. The tongue went through Garth's left cheek and came out through his mouth. Garth screamed, "Die, you foul beast!" Now bleeding from his cheek, Garth took one last charge at the toad. This time Garth would not miss. He lunged his bumblebee stinger at the toad, piercing it through the soul. "Hooray! Garth, hooray!" said Frizzy. Garth had lost too much blood and grew weary. He closed his eyes. The next time Garth would awake, he would find himself in the hospital wing at Toadfarts. Chapter 6. As Garth lay in the hospital wing in Toadfarts, he became aware of a tremendous pain in his left cheek. He grabbed a mirror and saw that the hole made by the evil toad had been stitched to hell and back, and the whole left side of his face was unrecognizable, but he believed it was still him. Just then, he heard a flute singing in the hallway and slowly approaching the door. Professor Bumbleiscoff burst in with children swinging on his arms and a whole crowd cheering behind him. Frizzy was being hailed on the back of a great giant naked mole rat. Bumbleiscoff was playing a very pleasant dancing tune. Toot toot, toot tut tu what to you at, tutum tut tut teetum. Toot. What is this ruckus all about? Cried Garth, most perturbed. We are celebrating my birthday. Bumblescorf responded. Now children, go away. I must speak with Garth. Garth and the old wizard sat there in silence while all the sick children were forced from their beds to give Garth and Bumblescorf some privacy. Garth could not help but wonder what would come next. He had so many questions about why he survived when his parents were murdered, why Frizzy's siblings had been murdered by such an evil toad, why he had never known his parents were wizard detectives. The list seemed to go on. I know you must have many questions for me, Garth, but knock it off. Why were you not at my birthday party? No, don't answer that. You were fighting a toad. Correct? How did you know? Garth asked in amazement. Frizzy told me. He also told me that you saved his parents. Professor. I don't think those are really his. Now, I know what you're going to say, Garth, but Frizzy's real parents were very strange freaks that worked in a circus. When they were eaten by lions, I simply replaced them with hedgehogs and Frizzy was none the wiser. Oh, that makes sense. Garth responded without pity. Garth, I must inform you that this toad attack is an extremely ominous sign. It could be a sign that he who cannot be named is returning. You must be on guard. Do you mean, Lord Fartamort? Garth asked cautiously. Yes, that's the guy. Gee whiz, I had forgotten his name. Good night. Garth fell asleep and found himself in a traitorous dream. He was surrounded by toads, but they couldn't see him. They were chanting loudly. Ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. They cried. Garth decided he had best speak to the manager, for he was very angry about the toad's disorderly conduct. Just then, a large man dressed all in green robes rose from the crowd. Garth couldn't make out his face, for he was hooded and dark. Come, my toads. Arise. Awake from your sleep. The dark and weird voice hissed. Garth awoke in a frenzy, surrounded by Frizzy, who was clamoring and pulling on his toes. Garth. Are you all right? Frizzy cried. Yeah, I'm okay. It was just a bad dream. Thank you for listening to Book 1. Garth has many mysteries and dangers lying ahead, so I hope you will come back to join me in musing over his little adventures.